Alright, here we go. The teachers point 10,500 BC, give or take, somewhere on a limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey. A group of people who had not yet invented pottery, had not yet invented the wheel, had not yet planted a single row of wheat, quarried, carved, and raised stone pillars, weighing up to 10 tons apiece. They arranged them in circles. They carved animals into them with a precision that would not be matched again for 6,000 years. And when they were finished, for reasons no one has ever adequately explained, they buried the whole site under tons of packed earth and walked away. That site is Göbekli Tepe. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids by 7,000. And it was built by people who, according to the conventional model of human development, should not have had the social organization to build it at all. Hunter-gatherers do not build monumental architecture. That is not an opinion. That is close to an axiom in archaeology, built on a century of comparative fieldwork. Monumental construction requires surplus food, a settled population, and a command structure capable of directing labor across years. Göbekli Tepe has none of the prerequisites and all of the output. So archaeologists did what archaeologists do when a site refuses to fit the model. They revise the model. Maybe religion came before farming, not after. Maybe belief itself was the technology that organized the first large groups of humans. That is a reasonable, sober, defensible position, but it explains the stones. It does not explain what is carved on them, because scattered across the pillars of Göbekli Tepe are humanoid figures, T-shaped, faceless, their arms folded across their chests in a specific deliberate posture, wearing what look like belts and loincloths carved in relief. They are not animals. They are not abstractions. They are beings, standing among the beasts, and the people who carved them clearly knew exactly who they were carving. And the strange part is not that Göbekli Tepe exists. The strange part is what happens when you leave that ridge and travel outward, across oceans, across 10,000 years, into civilizations that never met, never traded, never shared a word of language. You keep finding the same figure, different name, different face sometimes, but the same posture, the same function, the same story. Something arrives, something teaches, something leaves. And 8 civilizations, separated by every ocean and every millennium history has to offer, wrote it down as if they were describing the same afternoon. This is not a claim that ancient people were unsophisticated, credulous, or easily fooled by weather. The opposite is true in every single case on this list. Every civilization we are about to walk through had writing, or a rigorous oral transmission discipline that functioned like writing, mathematics, agriculture, and complex law before it ever set down the accounts we are going to look at. These were not people mistaking a shadow for a monster. These were the most careful record keepers of their respective eras, using the same administrative precision they applied to grain counts and royal genealogies, applying it instead to a memory of who was here before them. That distinction matters because the standard explanation for cross-cultural myth is projection. Humans everywhere fear the dark, need explanations for thunder, and invent parental gods to make sense of an indifferent universe. That explanation works beautifully for storms and mountains and the changing of the seasons. It works considerably less well when the detail in question is an orbital period accurate to a fraction of a percent, or a weathering pattern that requires a climate that ended 7,000 years before the builders were supposedly born, or a beard carved onto a population with no genetic capacity to grow one. Fear of the dark does not produce that kind of precision. Memory does. So here are 8 civilizations. In the order their surviving records were set down, each one independently describing an encounter with something that was not human, taught them something they did not have, and then left the Anunnaki start where writing starts. Sumer, roughly 3200 BC, the river cities of southern Mesopotamia, where a farming society under population pressure invented the world's first writing system to solve a logistics problem. How do you track whose grain is whose when the city has grown too large for memory to handle? That is the Sumerians in their most practical form. Accountants, bureaucrats, people obsessed with ledgers, and the same civilization that invented the receipt used that invention almost immediately to record the presence of beings they called the Anunnaki, a term that translates roughly to those of royal blood who came down, The Sumerian king list, one of the driest documents in the ancient world, a document whose entire purpose is to track succession the way a modern registry tracks property deeds, opens not with a human ruler, but with the statement that kingship itself descended from heaven. Not was invented, descended. The scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent 5 decades at the University of Pennsylvania translating cuneiform tablets by hand, noted repeatedly that Sumerian religious texts read less like devotional poetry and more like administrative memos. The Anunnaki argue. They vote. They get exhausted. In the Atrahasis epic, the lower-ranked Anunnaki, a group called the Igigi, stage what can only be described as a labor strike, refusing to keep digging irrigation canals until the senior gods agree to create a cheaper, more expendable workforce. That workforce is us. This is not the language a culture uses to describe the sunrise. Nobody negotiates with the sunrise. Nobody drafts a workaround for a river. The Sumerians gave the beings who founded their civilization schedules, grievances, and a chain of command, and cultures do not typically bother giving their metaphors a middle management problem. The Harvard scholar Thorkild Jacobson, in his 1976 study, The Treasures of Darkness, argued for the standard reading. The Anunnaki began as diffuse nature spirits and were gradually bureaucratized as Sumerian society itself grew more bureaucratic, the divine administration mirroring the earthly one, because that is simply how human projection works. It is a coherent theory, and it explains a great deal. What it strains to explain is the number. The Atrahasis is specific almost to the point of being clerical. Roughly 600 Anunnaki, split between those stationed on Earth and those left waiting in the sky, a subgroup called the Igigi. 600 is not a round mythic number, the way 7 or 12 tend to be. It reads like a head count, the kind of figure that shows up in a text because someone at some point actually counted. Then there are the Apkallu, the 7 sages of Mesopotamian tradition, carved into the palace walls of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud around 865 BC as fish-robed or eagle-headed humanoid figures, and described in tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, dated to roughly 650 BC, as being sent by the god Enki to transmit the arts of civilization before a catastrophic flood. The Apkallu do not rule. They instruct. The Anunnaki authorize. The Apkallu execute. It is, in the driest possible sense, an organizational chart, and the Sumerians, the people who invented writing, used that invention first to record that neither civilization nor writing itself began with them. The Nommo cross the Sahara, drop south into the Niger Bend, and you arrive at a tradition that has nothing to do with Sumer, shares no root language, and had, as far as any archaeological record shows, zero contact with Mesopotamia at any point in its 5,000-year existence. The Dogon people of Mali preserved, entirely through oral transmission, a body of cosmological knowledge that 2 French anthropologists, Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen, began documenting in the 1930s. What they recorded was specific enough that it is still argued about today. The Dogon described a class of beings called the Nommo, amphibious, intelligent, human-like above the waist, and finned or fish-tailed below it, who arrived in a spinning vessel that descended from the sky, entered the water, and from the water taught the ancestors of the Dogon the foundations of civilized life before eventually departing. That much, on its own, sits comfortably next to 100 other flood and teacher myths. What makes the Dogon case different is the astronomy. Dogon cosmology includes detailed information about Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, specifically the existence of a companion star, small, dense, and invisible to the naked eye, orbiting it on a fixed cycle. Western science did not confirm that companion star, now called Sirius B, until telescopic observation in the 19th century, and did not determine its extraordinary density, a white dwarf compressing roughly the mass of the Sun into a body the size of Earth, until the 20th. The Dogon gave its orbital period as 50 years. It is 49.9. The anthropologist Walter Van Beek returned to Dogon territory in 1991 and published a serious challenge in the journal Current Anthropology, arguing that the specific Sirius knowledge was not as widely distributed among ordinary Dogon as Griol's account implied, and raising the possibility that Griol's own questions had shaped the answers he received. That is a fair methodological objection, and it deserves to be taken seriously. It does not, however, explain where the number came from in the first place. A culture confabulating an answer to satisfy a curious foreign researcher does not typically confabulate an orbital period accurate to 0.2% for a star invisible without a telescope. You can question how the knowledge was transmitted within the tribe. It is much harder to explain how it entered the tradition at all. The Nommo are not described as gods in any abstract sense. They are described as travelers with a point of origin, a vehicle, and a purpose. Arriving in a vessel, the Dogon describe as spinning and noise-producing, entering water, transmitting knowledge from within the water, and departing. Multiple visits are described across enormous spans of time, not a single arrival, but a relationship maintained across generations. And roughly 3,000 years and an entire ocean away, a Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing around 290 BC for a skeptical Greek audience that he knew would find his claims absurd, described a being named Oannes, a fish body above a human body, emerging from the Persian Gulf in the earliest days of Babylonian civilization, teaching the assembled people writing, law, agriculture, and geometry each day before returning to the sea each night. Berossus adds, and every surviving fragment of his account preserves this detail without variation, that Oannes ate nothing during the hours he spent among humans. A symbol does not have a meal schedule. A metaphor for the sea does not decline lunch. The persistence of that one biologically strange, functionally pointless detail, across independent fragmentary transmissions spanning centuries, is the kind of thing that survives, not because it serves a symbolic purpose, but because whoever passed the story forward felt they had no right to leave it out, the Shining Ones. Now go north and west, to an island the Sumerians never heard of, where a people the Sumerians never met, wrote down, more than 2,000 years after the Atrahasis was composed, a national history that opens the same way. The Labor Gabala Eren, the medieval Irish Book of Invasions, compiled around the 11th century AD from oral material that is almost certainly far older, describes successive waves of settlers arriving in Ireland before the historical Irish, the Gaels, ever set foot on the island. The most significant of these were the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, who arrived, according to the oldest layer of the tradition, in dark clouds descending from the north, bringing with them 4 objects that no human craftsman could reproduce: a spear that never missed, a sword no one survived once drawn, a cauldron that never ran empty, and a stone that screamed when the rightful king touched it. When the Gaels eventually defeated them in battle, the Tuatha De Danann did not die, and they did not sail away. According to the tradition, they withdrew into the hills, the specific hills that Irish farmers could point to on a map for the next 1,000 years. Hills that Irish folklore continued to treat as inhabited long after the country had officially converted to Christianity. The scholar Anne Ross, writing in her 1967 study, Pagan Celtic Britain, proposed that the Tuatha De Danann were deified ancestors, historical figures elevated by generations of storytelling into something resembling gods. It is a defensible reading, but their leader, the Dagda, undercuts it in an odd way. He is described not as radiant or terrifying, but as large, aging, and faintly ridiculous, dragging an oversized club, permanently associated with an enormous appetite. That is not how you build a symbol from scratch. That is how you remember a person. And there is a detail that resists tidy explanation entirely. The name Danu, mother figure of the Tuatha De Danann, appears with striking similarity on the other side of the Indo-European world, in the Sanskrit tradition, where Danu is the mother of the Danavas, a race of powerful non-human beings who preceded the current divine order and were eventually driven underground after losing a war with a younger generation of gods. Ereval, civilization building, conflict, withdrawal into the earth. That is not one story, that is the same plot, appearing in Irish legend and Vedic scripture, cultures with no direct contact, and at best, a linguistic root shared so far back in prehistory that most etymologists treat the Danu connection with real caution. The caution is warranted. The structural repetition is harder to wave away. The Tuatha De Danann were not described the way the Irish would later describe the Christian God: distant, invisible, omnipotent. They are described as neighbors, with a complicated history. They lost battles. They negotiated treaties. They intermarried with humans and left descendants who appear, generations later, in the genealogies of real Irish kings, listed with the same matter-of-fact confidence used to record cattle raids and dynastic marriages. And the objects they brought resist symbolic reading in the same way the Anunnaki's head count does. A spear that never misses, a sword no one survives once drawn, a cauldron that never empties, a stone that screams under the rightful king. These are not poetic descriptions of weather or seasons. They are object descriptions with specific functions and specific named owners, recorded with the precision of an inventory rather than the elasticity of a fable. The people who built Newgrange, one of the most astronomically precise Neolithic monuments anywhere on Earth, its inner chamber illuminated for a few minutes each year at the winter solstice and no other time, are associated in Irish tradition with exactly this race of luminous, skilled, non-human builders, a connection archaeology has never found a fully comfortable way to address, the Neteru. Egypt kept better records than almost any civilization in the ancient world. Tax receipts, grain audits, medical case notes, court judgments, all preserved in a documentary tradition covering roughly 3,000 years with an obsessive, almost bureaucratic precision, which is exactly what makes the Egyptian material on its own origins so strange, because it is the one category of Egyptian record that does not behave like the rest. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus between 237 and 57 BC, but explicitly claiming to preserve a far older tradition, describe the founding of Egypt's original sacred sites not by pharaohs and not by the familiar gods of the dynastic period, but by beings called the Neteru, who inhabited a primeval homeland before a great flood destroyed it. The word Neteru is conventionally translated as gods. It more literally suggests those who watch, a term implying active, ongoing supervision rather than distant, abstract divinity. And the Edfu text describe them functioning less like objects of worship and more like a construction crew. They arrive at a location, they lay out a specific sacred geometry, they build, and when the flood comes, the survivors move on to found the next site, carrying the same blueprint forward. Egyptology has generally classified this material as later theological elaboration, myth layered onto history for religious effect. That is a reasonable default position for any ancient text describing prehistory. But the geological and astronomical evidence sits uncomfortably close to the Edfu chronology. In 1992, the geologist Robert Schoch presented an analysis of the erosion patterns on the enclosure walls surrounding the Great Sphinx, arguing that the weathering was caused by prolonged, heavy rainfall, a climate pattern the Giza Plateau has not experienced since somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 BC, thousands of years before the dynastic Egyptians, conventionally credited with the Sphinx's construction. Separately, Robert Bauval demonstrated that the layout of the three Giza pyramids mirrors the belt stars of Orion as they would have appeared in the sky around 10,500 BC. Two independent methods, one geological, one astronomical, converge on roughly the same distant date, a date that also happens to sit inside the range the Edfu texts themselves assign to the founding of Egypt's first sacred sites. None of the researchers coordinated their conclusions. The Egyptians who carved the Turin king list around 1200 BC did not hedge or mythologize the rest of their history. They only did it, if that is what happened, for the section describing who was there first. The Turin document presents the pharaonic succession with the same administrative dryness used elsewhere for grain records and census data, name after name after name. But before the historical pharaohs, it inserts a category of pre-dynastic rulers, the followers of Horus, and before them a line of beings said to have reigned for periods measured in the tens of thousands of years. Mainstream Egyptology classifies that section as later mythological interpolation, scribes padding the record with legend. That is a reasonable default. But it is worth noting that the same scribes, in every other section of the same document, never once confused administration with myth. They were plainly capable of the distinction. The fact that they filed the pre-dynastic beings under the identical format used for verified historical kings suggests they did not experience the difference as a categorical one. Every pharaoh who ever raised a temple did so, by Egypt's own account, working from a blueprint he had not originated. The Edfu texts quietly insist on a question Egyptology has never fully closed the door on. Whose blueprint was it? Viracocha, stand at the Gate of the Sun in Tiwanaku, in the Bolivian highlands near Lake Titicaca, and look up at the figure carved into the lintel. He is frontal, rigid, holding a staff in each hand, with rays or tears streaming from his eyes in a pattern that appears, in nearly identical form, at the much older site of Chivin de Huantar in Peru, 1,000 years earlier. By the time the Inca rose to power and encountered Tiwanaku, the city was already an ancient ruin. The Inca did not build it. They inherited it, already collapsed, already half buried, and did what every culture does with a monument it cannot explain. They absorbed it into their own origin story, naming the figure Viracocha, the instructor of the world. The Spanish chroniclers Pedro de Cieza de Leon and Juan de Betanzos, writing independently in the 1550s within a few years of the conquest, recorded remarkably consistent Andean accounts. Viracocha arrived after a great flood, created the sun and moon, shaped the first humans, taught them, and then departed westward across the Pacific, promising to return. The archaeologist John Rowe of UC Berkeley made a careful, credible argument that one detail in these accounts was contaminated by contact. The Inca described Viracocha as pale-skinned and bearded, and Rowe suggested this detail was quietly adjusted after the Spanish arrived. To make sense of the newcomers, post-conquest revision of oral tradition is a documented real problem across Andean ethnohistory, and Rowe's caution deserves respect. But it does not touch the iconography, because the bearded, staff-carrying staff god at Chivin de Huantar predates any European contact by roughly 2,000 years, and Andean populations are, as a matter of straightforward genetics, characteristically close to beardless. The description existed in stone 100 generations before there was anyone from across the Atlantic for the Inca to compare him to. Thor Heyerdahl's 1947 Kon-Tiki expedition demonstrated that a reed vessel could survive an open ocean crossing westward across the Pacific, lending at least physical plausibility to the direction Viracocha is said to have gone. Whether that detail is literal or symbolic remains genuinely disputed. What is not disputed is that three separate Anshan cultures, the Chavin, the Wari, and the Tiwanaku, none of them the Inca, carved the same face in the same posture across more than 1,000 years of otherwise independent cultural development. Some researchers who have studied the Gate of the Sun in detail have proposed that the carved markings surrounding the central figure encode astronomical information, specific star positions tied to specific points in the agricultural calendar, which would mean the weeping face is not primarily an emotional portrait at all. It would be a calendar wearing a face. The Inca did not invent Viracocha. By their own account, they inherited him from cultures whose names they no longer remembered, and when the Spanish finally arrived in 1532, the Inca told them, without apparent hesitation, that the instructor of the world had already left, walking west into the ocean, gone rather than dead. To the Inca, that distinction mattered enormously. You mourn the dead. You wait for the departed, the watchers. Genesis chapter 6 contains 4 verses that most readers skim past entirely, sandwiched between a genealogy and the flood narrative. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took wives from among them, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, giants, men of renown. Then the text moves on, with no explanation offered, as if the editors themselves were uncomfortable lingering. For centuries, this was treated by biblical scholarship as an orphaned fragment, an editorial leftover from a tradition too old, and too strange for the compilers of Genesis to fully excise. Then, between 1947 and 1956, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at Qumran, and among the fragments recovered from Cave 4 was an Aramaic manuscript of the Book of Enoch, a text older than Genesis's final compilation, written in the everyday language of the region rather than ceremonial Hebrew. The Book of Enoch does not treat those 4 verses as a fragment. It treats them as the compressed summary of an entire narrative. 200 beings called Watchers, led by 2 figures named Semjaza and Azazel, descend on Mount Hermon, take human wives, and then commit what the text frames as the actual crime, more serious than the marriages themselves. They teach. Azazel teaches metalworking and weaponcraft. Others teach astronomy, medicine, and the reading of omens. The punishment for this transmission of forbidden knowledge is imprisonment beneath the earth, awaiting final judgment, and the destruction of their offspring in the flood that follows. The scholar Margaret Barker has argued that the Watcher tradition predates the canonical Hebrew Bible and was deliberately compressed during the editorial process that produced Genesis as we now have it, a process that left just enough behind that later readers would know something had been cut. What makes this account worth placing beside the others is not the moral judgment attached to it, but the underlying shape. Non-human beings cross into the human world. They teach specific, transformative knowledge, and then they are removed, permanently, imprisoned rather than departed. The Sumerians celebrated their Apkallu sages for the exact category of act the Book of Enoch condemns the Watchers for committing. Two traditions agreeing on precisely what happened while reaching opposite conclusions about whether it was good. The Aramaic manuscript designated 4Q2001, one of the oldest surviving copies of the Book of Enoch, is not a ceremonial or decorative text. It is written in the ordinary spoken language of Judea, the kind of language used for correspondence and record-keeping, not liturgy. Its presence at Qumran, hidden in a cave for roughly 2,000 years, tells you that the community that preserved it considered it too significant to lose and too dangerous, or too doctrinally awkward, to include in the version of Scripture that was meant for general circulation. The Zoroastrian tradition, developing independently in Persia, describes an analogous split within a single original class of divine beings, the Ahoras and the Daivas, dividing over their relationship to humanity. The Vedic tradition describes the Asuras in almost the same structural terms, powerful non-human beings who preceded the current divine order and were driven into the underworld after conflict. Different scriptures, different languages, different moral verdicts, and underneath all of it, the same event, Fuxi and Nuwa. China's oldest layer of origin tradition does not center on a single lawgiver. It centers on a pair, and the pairing itself is the strange part. Fuxi and Nuwa appear across Han Dynasty tomb reliefs, dated to roughly the 2nd century BC, but drawing on oral material that predates the Han by centuries, depicted with human heads and torsos, above intertwined serpent lower bodies, holding, respectively, a carpenter's square and a compass, the two instruments required to measure and construct anything at all. According to the tradition, Fuxi is credited with inventing writing, the trigrams that underlie the I Ching, the domestication of animals, and the rules of marriage and social order. Nuwa is credited with repairing a broken sky after a catastrophic celestial collapse, and, in the older layers of the myth, with molding the first humans out of yellow river clay. Sinologists have generally treated the serpent bodies as symbolic, representing fertility, continuity, and the intertwining of yin and yang, the two complementary forces that structure Chinese cosmology. That reading is coherent and well supported within the broader symbolic grammar of Chinese art. But it sits alongside an odd insistence, repeated across multiple independent tomb sites separated by centuries, on physical specificity, the exact number of coils, the exact posture of the tails, the exact tools held in the hands, details that a purely symbolic figure has little reason to standardize so rigidly across independent workshops, with no central authority coordinating the imagery. Fuxi and Nuwa are described as pre-dynastic, ruling before the recorded emperors, credited with giving humanity the specific technical foundations, measurement, writing, and social structure on which everything afterward was built. And then, in the oldest tellings, they are gone, replaced by a fully human dynastic line, with no further serpent-bodied rulers, appearing in the record again, the Wandjina. The Kimberley region of northwestern Australia holds one of the longest continuously maintained rock art traditions on Earth, with some sites showing evidence of repainting and ritual maintenance stretching back, by the account of the Aboriginal custodians themselves, tens of thousands of years, a claim broadly consistent with archaeological dating of the region's earliest occupation. Painted across rock shelters throughout the region are the Wandjina, large, humanoid figures with wide, dark eyes, no mouths, and heads surrounded by a halo-like arrangement of lines that Aboriginal tradition identifies specifically as depicting clouds and lightning. The Wandjina are described by the Warora, Ngarnyin, and Wunumbal peoples, the traditional custodians of the sites, as ancestral beings who came from the sky and the sea, brought the law that structures social and ceremonial life, shaped the landscape itself, and then, having finished, entered the rock at specific painted sites and remained there, requiring periodic ritual repainting to keep their power active. The absent mouth is the detail outside researchers have puzzled over longest. Aboriginal tradition offers a consistent explanation across multiple language groups separated by real geographic distance. The Wandjina possessed power so total that if they spoke after their work was finished, the resulting rain and lightning would flood the world. So they chose silence. Anthropologists, including Ian Crawford, who conducted extensive fieldwork in the Kimberley beginning in the 1960s, have generally read the Wandjina as ancestral rain and fertility spirits, central to the region's law and ceremony, a reading grounded directly in what the traditional custodians themselves say, and that reading should be the primary one. What remains genuinely unresolved is why a rain spirit is drawn with the specific anatomical restraint of an absent mouth, a detail maintained with remarkable consistency across a painting tradition spanning multiple language groups, and, by some estimates, tens of thousands of years, longer than any other visual record on the planet, 8 traditions. Sumer, the Dogon of Mali, pre-Christian Ireland, dynastic Egypt, the pre-Inca Andes, ancient Israel, early China, and Aboriginal Australia. Civilizations that did not trade with each other, did not share alphabets, and in several of these pairings could not possibly have exchanged so much as a rumor by any transmission route currently known to archaeology, and yet lay their accounts side by side, and you are not looking at 8 unrelated inventions. You are looking at one recurring structure, described independently, with a consistency that gets harder to explain the more specific the details become. In every single case, a being or class of beings arrives from outside the ordinary human world, by water, by sky, or both. In every case, the central act is the transmission of foundational knowledge, writing, measurement, agriculture, law, astronomy, the specific technologies a culture needed to become a civilization rather than a scattered population. In every case, the beings are described with unmistakably physical, specific detail, postures, garments, tools, physical traits their own people did not share, and in every case, without exception, they leave. Not fade into abstraction, not get absorbed into later gods, leave. Withdraw into hills, descend beneath the earth, walk into the sea, retreat into painted stone, and never come back. Compare that against how genuinely symbolic figures behave across mythology. The trickster keeps tricking. The dying god keeps dying and rising with the seasons. The mother goddess keeps giving birth, year after year, harvest after harvest. Those are cycles, built to mirror nature's own repetition. What we have across these 8 traditions is not a cycle. It is a single, non-repeating event, arrival, instruction, departure, remembered with the specificity of something witnessed, rather than the elasticity of something invented. If this were simply the universal grammar of human imagination, the details should drift. Height and light are common symbols of power in almost any culture, so broad physical similarity across traditions is not on its own remarkable. But orbital periods accurate to a fraction of a percent for an invisible star are not symbolism. Weathering patterns on limestone, requiring millennia of rainfall that stopped falling before the conventional builders were born, are not symbolism. A beard carved into stone 100 generations before contact on a population that does not grow beards is not symbolism. Those are data points, and data points that converge independently across non-contacting civilizations are considerably harder to file away. None of this proves what these beings were. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and anyone offering you certainty in either direction, contact or coincidence, is offering you more confidence than the evidence supports. What can be said is narrower and, in its ways, stranger. 8 civilizations, working in isolation, describing their own founding with a precision and a consistency that the standard explanation. Independent cultures projecting the same universal anxieties onto the unknown does not fully account for. Consider what it would take for this to be pure coincidence. It would require Sumerian scribes, Dogon elders, medieval Irish monks copying pre-Christian oral material, Egyptian priests at Edfu, Andean stonemasons at Shavan, the community that hid the Enoch scrolls at Qumran, Han Dynasty tomb painters, and Aboriginal custodians in the Kimberley, working across roughly 10,000 years of separation with no shared route of contact. To each independently invent a being that arrives from outside the human world, teaches specific and identifiable technologies, is described with unusually consistent physical particulars, and then departs in a single, non-repeating event rather than a seasonal cycle. Coincidence does not typically hold that many variables constant. Every additional matching detail, the number, the weathering, the beard, the mouth, the meal schedule, makes the coincidence explanation carry more weight than it visibly wants to. Every one of these civilizations spent centuries, in some cases millennia, carving the same basic story into stone, clay, and memory. None of them, across all that labor, ever claimed to have made it up. They claimed to be remembering it. And if you are still here, still watching, that probably means you are the kind of person who would rather sit with a question that has no clean answer than accept one that only pretends to be complete, Sudisber, and come back. There is more of the record we have not gotten to yet, and the pattern keeps getting harder to explain, not easier.